This evening, our guest speaker is Dave Rogers. I've known Dave for many years, met him many times at the library doing research work, and he's also a local author, books on the lumbering and some of our interesting folklore. So Dave is extremely knowledgeable in the early history of our community, and he will be showing us some great stuff tonight. Okay?
Hope so. Thank you, Don.
Okay.
We ready to go?
Yep.
Well, I want to thank Don and Don Morin. I guess I'm not sure Don is here. I want to thank Don and Don Morin and Carl here for setting all this up, and it's wonderful just to bring in a thumb drive and not have to set up all the equipment. So,
Everybody hearing all right? Yeah, talk right into it.
hello.
There you go.
Okay. So I decided to write something, actually to do a presentation about the French Empire in North America, which led me to my latest book, which came out, about a month ago, called Historic Tales of Michigan Up North. And it's been selling quite well, and it was a real experience. Usually I'm self-published, and I run around with books in the back seat of my car selling them. That's not really the way to do it. So this company came along, contacted me. I think Tim Yonkman may have put them on to me because they did a couple of his books. So anyway, the French Empire in North America is much important to us because that's really how we got started here in Michigan. And we were part of Quebec here until 1760. And then the British took over for until 1776. And the British were going to make Michigan Indian country. So it would have been like Oklahoma. All the Indian tribes were going to be exiled here. So that didn't happen. But interesting part of history that has not been delved into too much. So New France, they started coming early in the 1600s, and of course we had Cadillac and people like that who settled Detroit. But first Cadillac was in Mackinac City, Mackinac Island, those areas. I really was interested in this because of my family and my heritage. I'm half French through my mother, and at Laframboise, and the Laframboises are well known, that name, throughout the North Country and Detroit and so on. One of the Laframboises was among the 100 soldiers who went into, French soldiers who went into Detroit with Cadillac in 1701 and started that city. My family came here in 1872 to work in the lumber industry, so I kind of got into genealogy a little bit with this. And then I have a long-term goal to write a book filling in the gaps of a book by the famous Professor Bernard Bailyn, who's been a Harvard icon since 1949 and is 96 years old. And I was, the Pulitzer granted him his third Pulitzer Prize in history for a few years ago for a book entitled The Barbarous Years Settling British North America. And I'm just finishing that book. It's a wonderful book for reading and going to sleep, too. Some criticism has been leveled at the eminent Dr. Bailyn for failing to appreciate the other ethnic group, because he's talking about the British North America. I mean, obviously the French were here decades before the English, and he really didn't treat that much. And the Spanish, the French in Canada and the Spanish in Florida, and of course the indigenous peoples and the imported black slaves are part of that story too. He didn't mention much of that. But my wife Dolores is here. I should have introduced her. And my daughter Ann. They're sitting over there. One has a Coke, and the other has a Sprite. But this, it's like old home week at this church because I spent a lot of time here. I was a friend of the minister's son, John Davies. Some of you may remember that name. He was here, I think, until about 1950 or 52. And we rambled all over this church. And, of course, there are catacombs in the basement here. They were going to bury people there. I don't know how many people know much about that. But the catacombs are still down there, of course. They're kind of boarded up, but you can't get into it. But anyway, it was quite an exciting adventure for young boys to find these catacombs and, play games like we did. So, what I want to do is an overly ambitious project, but that's my specialty, do something that I probably can't do. I'm a newspaper man turned historian based on several classes in history at Michigan State University. So anyway, Dolores, my wife, and I went to Harvard for a conference, and we met the eminent Dr. Baylin, and I went up to him and said, oh yes, I had a professor from Harvard at Michigan State. And he looked at me with scorn and said, I don't believe anyone from Harvard ever taught at Michigan State. And I said, no, his name was Professor Cantor, and he was such a great lecturer. People would come in from outside and file along the walls to listen to this guy. He was just terrific instructor, lecturer, So we went to check into the motel, and it was called the Harvard Inn, but didn't have any connection with Harvard. So the manager there says, oh my God, I can't find your reservation. He said, would you mind if I put you up at the Harvard Faculty Club tonight? And we said, no, we didn't know what it was, didn't know anything about it. Well, it was really opulent, And of course, we were just going to dinner when the eminent Dr. Baylin was coming out, and he looked at us and just shrank back, and I'm sure he was thinking, there's those insects from Michigan State University. Anyway, I don't know. It was fun doing it, I guess. 3 days in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Moving on to more mundane details of the French Empire. We have local connections that are not readily apparent. The Native Americans of North America are believed to be descendants of the Mongoloids, early hunter-gatherers who migrated from Asia around 30,000 BC. These Stone Age people crossed an ice-age land bridge, now the Bering Strait, during the Pleistocene epoch. Pleistocene, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And then the Jesuits, of course, arrived early in Canada. And the first Jesuit, actually, I guess the first white man to come down to Michigan was Father Henri Nouvel, who the Indians paddled him down the shore of Lake Huron and into Saginaw Bay and up the Saginaw River in 1675. The Chippewa Indians paddled him there, and they got off the track and went up Squaw Creek and had to backtrack. How we know this, I don't know. I guess he must have written something for the Jesuit Relations, which was their reports to the bishop in France all the time. He was the first European visitor to the Saginaw Valley, and there is, I think I might have a, let's try the next slide, Carl. Well, this is about Louis XIV. You probably heard about him. Actually, Marie Antoinette is a little bit better known. She's the one who said, if the people have no bread, let them eat cake. And, of course, they cut her head off. But that's another story, isn't it? There's a monument on Ojibwe Island. Now let's see if I've got that on there. To Father Nouvelle, and of course there's a high school named after him. I want to try the next. Oh, that's the Beaver. And there's one of the freight canoes. They had one at River of Time last year. They're about 40 feet long, and it could carry tons of furs all baled up. So there's a little bit of the history of the background. But the first two Frenchmen who came here was the grandfather of the Tremblays, Mater and Joseph Tremblay, and he built a couple of sloops at the mouth of the river and somehow got in a altercation with an Indian, was stabbed, and died on his way trying to paddle to Detroit around the harbor beach. And anyway, so that was kind of a misstep there. He built two sloops, and somewhere I have a history of the 888 vessels. 888 vessels were built. That's by my count. I don't know whether Don would agree with that or not, but that's what I came up with. That, and that's, there's none being built now, of course, and that went on until the closing of the Defoe Shipbuilding in 1977. My grandfather worked for Defoe, and he was the printer there. So he lived right straight across the street here, and it was an Aladdin home, right directly across the street. Then the next house was occupied by my mother's uncle, Geiger, and then the next house was Gilbert Hand's house. And I lived in all three of those houses, not at the same time, obviously. But so this is my territory from years gone by. Let's see what else we got here, Carl. You want to try another one? That's a beaver. There's the bales of furs. Now, the guys paddling the canoe probably were called hivernants. The Hiver, H-I-V-E-R, is the winter. So they would winter with the Indians, gather up all the furs, and then in the spring, bale them up and take them to Mackinac Island. That was the main trading post. And, of course, they had big rendezvous there. And there was the French fort, of course, on the mainland, which there's a replica of it now. And so they'd have these big trading deals, and everybody get pretty well plastered and get in fights and all those kinds of things. But let's see. Father Nouvelle is said to have remarked on the scrub trees growing within sight of Lake Huron. Tiny trees that 2 centuries later had grown to huge pines and oaks. So when he came down the shore of the bay in 1675, so by 1825 or so, those trees had had a couple hundred years to grow and were huge trees. And that fed the mills, helped make the Saginaw Valley the world headquarters of the lumber trade. And that's a story you can study for a long time. And that was a quarter of a century before LaSalle built Fort Pontchartrain at Detroit. Cadillac, and I'm talking about Cadillac. Cadillac has been called by a French writer as definitely not one of the great early heroes, but probably deserves to be ranked with the worst scoundrels ever to set foot in New France. What he did was the bishop of the Jesuits stopped him from trading liquor with the Indians at Michilimackinac. And so he loaded up these 50 canoes with 100 soldiers and went to Detroit, where things were a little looser. And he was the one who really gave Detroit its start. And Here's another writer who said, refers to Cadillac as a Gascon adventurer, the most wicked character in the world. A scatterbrain expelled from France for I don't know what reason. Anyway, I haven't read any biographies of Cadillac, but when I need some excitement in my life, I guess I'll have to do that. Where are we here? The legacy of the French Empire, and that blue area all was the French Empire in Cadillac's day. So you can say it covered Michigan all the way down to Louisiana, and then up into Illinois, and then the brown is Spain, I guess, yeah. And then the lighter brown is Great Britain. So anyway, they had a huge presence here in North America. And basically a lot of our colleges, the Jesuit colleges, were quite famous, Marquette, and many others. The French Empire in North America lasted only a little more than 5 decades, but we still have French influence that's evident, especially in Michigan. Let's try the next slide. The thing about the French is that that came to light was that, and this kind of sums it up, the Spanish civilization crushed the Indian, English civilization scorned and neglected him, French civilization embraced and cherished him. The Jesuits lived with the Indians, they learned their language, and so the French really had a better connection to get the furs than the English did. The English were kind of tough on them. So let's see what we got, the next one here. Well, there's an old picture of Michigan. And where's Saginaw Bay? It's in there somewhere. Chicago. Anyway, that's a very old map. But for Monsieur Cadillac's foibles and flaws, our history might have been different. In the 1830s, French aristocrats Alexis de Tocqueville and Gustave de Beaumont toured the United States to study prisons for the French government. They visited Saginaw, stopping at Green Point near where the Germania Club is or was located. Germania Club, I think, is defunct, but that's where they went. They didn't get up this far, and they wanted to go to Mackinac Island, so they actually turned back, went back to Detroit, and then went up Lake Huron to get to Mackinac Island. And they wrote several books about their experiences here, including a novel by Beaumont, which was called Marie, basically predicting racial problems that led to the Civil War. Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America, is better known and examined the democratic revolution that had been going on for the past several hundred years. So de Tocqueville and Beaumont traveled all over the country. In 1980, New York Times columnist Richard Reeves was somewhat of a television presence for a while, but he isn't much anymore. He was hired by Simon & Schuster to follow the trail of Tocqueville and Beaumont. And he came up to the Bay City Times and introduced himself and was looking for somebody to take him around. So I drove him around over to Midland and so on. Got to know him a little bit. He had a few toddies someplace along the line. But he later that year, 1980, I represented the newspaper at a conference with the Carter administration in Washington. And Jimmy Carter brought us all into the cabinet room and introduced us to his chief officers. And all these there were 40 editors and me. I was just an editorial writer. These guys were real big shots from Grand Rapids and all the Booth and Newhouse papers all over the country. So they couldn't think of anything to ask. Actually, it was Brzezinski's, big new Brzezinski, who was Mika Brzezinski's father. He was the national security advisor. So I ventured a question, and I said, Mr. Brzezinski, what are you going to do about the hostages in Iran? And he said, what would you do? I said, no, you're the national security advisor. He says, what do you want me to do? Kiss the Ayatollah's, you know what? So I called up Richard Reeves in New York, and I said, Dick, you can't imagine, things are really messed up at the White House. That hasn't changed much. But anyway, he said, oh, that's interesting. Can I use that? So my name was in 250 newspapers all across the country. And I got a letter from the head of the Washington Bureau, and that was basically the end of my newspaper career. So they didn't, but that was what the guy said. You know, that was the truth. That was not fake news. So let's see. There's the Cadillac emblem from the cars there. It's a phony emblem because Cadillac drew it himself, and he really didn't have any royal background or anything like that. So there's the Métis, woods runners, pioneers of the fur trade. There they are with their bales of furs. And let's see what the next one is. We'll work our way through this a little faster. Etienne Brûlé, he was an evil explorer. He spent time with the Indians and became like an Indian himself. And then he betrayed one of the other French leaders who was killed then. And the Indians ended up killing him. But he led quite an adventuresome life, and there's an account of that in my book. I just came out with this book. I didn't come out with it. The publisher did, but there's an account of Brûlé's exploits in this book, and it's kind of startling if you read it. I'd never been able to find anything. The interaction between the Indians. They were savages. That's my family, really. They were savages, and so when the Jesuits came, and they were sticklers they were very disciplined, and you can imagine nothing but those robes on and 20-degree below zero weather. So how they did it, I don't know. Let's see the next one, Carl. John Jacob Astor. That was really what his name was, not Astor. And the Métis woman was Madame Laframboise. She had been married to a Laframboise who was killed by the Indians, and she became almost as famous a fur trader as Astor. And eventually he bought her out, and she built a house on Mackinac Island, and you can go there today. She's buried in the church cemetery right next to the church. So let's go to, this is my family in the 50s, and my uncle is in the middle there standing up. He looks like an Indian, if you ever saw one. And then my Uncle Leo, they had 2 boys and 2 girls. One boy and one girl looked Indian. And the other 2, my mother and Uncle Leo, didn't. So you can see the woman over on the right side is a full-blooded Ottawa Indian, supposedly the daughter of a chief. They all were chiefs. I went up to the reservation last year for a funeral, One of my cousins had died. And every street there is named after a different chief. So they were all chiefs and no Indians, I guess you could say. And there's my grandfather seated there, the old gentleman. He looked quite dark also. And those are some of my Uncle Leo's kids. Well, some of them I think were my Uncle Paul's kids. So that's, kind of a connection with the genealogy. The Jesuits established 28 colleges and universities in 18 states, including notably University of Detroit, Marquette, Georgetown, St. Louis, Fordham. I took one class at Georgetown Law School, which I'll never forget. I was working in Washington for a Republican congressman at that time. So I went over to Georgetown and took this one class. I just barely passed the law school admission test. So I took a class in contract law. I thought that would be easy. So through the door, we were all seated in these tiered seats. Through the door comes the professor with a lightning blue suit on. He jumps up on top of the big bench there, and he's got a book in his hand. And he holds the book up and he says, "This is Yeager's revision of Williston on contracts, the best known and the best book on contract law ever written." He says, Yeager's revision of Williston on contract. I am Yeager. Now, I want you to remember this, and I want you all to repeat after me as loudly as you can. Get the fee in advance. Get the fee in advance. So he's got this whole room full of law students chanting, get the fee in advance. I never forgot that either. Just little side notes there. Okay, let's try one, Carol. Jesuit relations. Again, if you want to go to sleep, you can read this, and they steered clear of anything that was controversial, of course. But anyway, that was the story. So let's see what the next one is. Oh, there's the Father Nouvelle. He said mass on the banks of the river at Christmas. Lived with the Indians by the Tridge in Midland. That was one of the main sites of Indian occupation in this area. But 22 miles in November and 22 days in November and December paddling down here. They must have been a little chilled. So there's some interesting stories about that. But that, if you look around, what's that island in Saginaw? Ojibwe Island. You'll see that monument. Okay, let's try another one here. Of course, I got to get the Bernies in here. This is William Bernie. He was in Paris teaching at a university when the French Revolution of 1848 broke out, and he fought with the French rebels on the barricades, and probably he's up there by that flag or something. But he was, of course, had lived in Bay City and became a pretty famous Civil War general. Almost trapped Robert E. Lee the day before the surrender, but he was held back by General Ord, and when he argued, he was fired on the battlefield. So the war went on one more day than it had to, and another 600 or 700 people were killed. So he was 88 years old, died in Washington, D.C., where he'd been a prosecutor. Okay, let's see. There's my Up North book. And I've got a few of them here if somebody wants one. Now we're going to go into the, can we go to the Saganing Indians? In writing this latest book, in writing this latest book, I came across a story about an actress of Indian heritage whose name was Kateri Walker. And I interviewed her by phone. And she had gone to Midland Dow High School, or maybe Midland High School, and then to Northern Michigan. Anyway, she's an actress in Hollywood. And I couldn't get the publisher to put a picture of her in the book, but anyway, it was an interesting story. She had been sent to an Indian school, which was run by the government, and the purpose of the Indian schools was to take the Indian out of the child. That was what they tried to do. So they wouldn't let them speak their own language. And she recounts a little bit of that in the interview that I had with her. And so that was a fascinating part of that. Some other stories that I came across, and I talked about Idlewild, the only Negro ghost town in Michigan. Spike Horn, who kept bears up near Harrison. Maybe some of you folks went by when he was around. The Purple Gang, I got a picture of some of the Purple Gang characters. The Cross in the Woods up north there. Jack Parker was a writer and advertising mad, and he tells an interesting story about Hemingway. Of course, Hemingway spent a lot of time up north, 20 years straight, until he after the First World War, he never returned. But Jack Parker had a little run-in with him in Paris, and he recounts it in his book. He's got a really good book about all the shipwrecks on the lakes. And Hemingway said, "How do you like this book?" I think it was To Have and to Have Not or something like that. So he says that was a bunch of junk. He said the movie was worse. He said, "By the way, what did you say your name was?" He says Hemingway, and it's kind of an interesting story. The publishers were very interested in that story. Hemingway stayed one night at the Perry Hotel when he was still in high school for 75 cents. Of course, it's probably about $200 now. I got a picture of Dick DeMara. You probably all know Dick when he was working on the bridge. And he had worked for Argus Camera, and he took pictures of every ship that went under the bridge when he was up on the high wire, or whatever you want to call it. The German prisoners, Stafford Smith, I interviewed him. He owns the Perry Hotel and Bayview Inn and so on. An interesting story. Really only held one job, and that was at that same place, the Bayview Inn. I did cover the Cedarville sinking, and there's some stuff in there that's fascinating. Some of the guys who have died, who survived the sinking, have been cremated and have had divers go down and place their remains on the ship. It's kind of a gruesome thing, but they wanted to be with their pals on the ship. So these kinds of little stories, Red Adair had a heck of a time finding a picture of him. We put out the Gaylord gas well fire, and of course he's the one who went to Iraq and put out like 1,500 fires in the oil wells out there. And the Alpena limestone quarry story, I didn't really get into too much because it was a little tedious, but I'm not sure what year, it was in the 60s, I believe. I was sent, actually Denny Gadeen contacted me. He says, "I want you to write up a story. They're going to have a big blast in the quarry in Alpena this weekend." And he says, "My friend Dynamite Al Hewitt, who works for Hercules Powder, is going to be setting this off, and I want to get the story out prior to this happening. So I wrote the story about what I knew, and I don't know whether I talked to Dynamite Al or not, but anyway. So when I got to Alpena, or I stopped at the Holland Hotel, I think, and the paper had come out, and all the big shots from the powder company and the quarry were there, and they were really mad at me. They said, if that wind is blowing onshore, it's going to break all the windows in Alpena, and then probably the tile in Mr. Fletcher's brand new house, and you are really in trouble. They were madder than heck at me. So we got up there, and 15 minutes before the blast was going to go, the wind shifted offshore, and so it didn't cause any problems. But there was a picture in Life magazine of they shot off 100 holes consecutively, boom, 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 and it was really something, a whole wall of the quarry. So those kinds of things I've been covering for years. The Basic Times used to cover all the North Country, used to lay bundles of papers on the porch of the Grand Hotel before noon every day. Well, those days are long gone. Anyway, I met this guy here in Bay City, Jack York, and he claimed to be an Indian chief, that he was the chief of Saganing, and he wanted to do something about the conditions up there, and would I go up and write about this? So Jack was quite a tippler about town, and I was a little hesitant, but anyway, I went up. And so some of the pictures that I had in my article were taken by Wes Stafford in 1973. So this old guy was Daniel Greensky, and he's one of, I think there were like 6 people living there. All the others their houses had fallen apart, and they had been moved out into different places, and so I interviewed them as best I could. There's some other, the pictures are just, I think, terrific. I don't know whether Wes ever won an award for it or not. Let's look at the next one. Now that was his heating. You could see right through the walls, the holes in the walls, and pot-bellied stove. And that green sky is quite prominent around up north and in Saganing. So let's see what we got next. Oh, the Indians felt they were cheated, that they had some money had been received. Actually, the first thing that I covered was the Indians were granted $10 million by a federal court. The Indians from here, and this was way back in the 60s. And I checked with some of the Indians and said, have you got your check yet? No, we haven't got any check. So I called the attorney back, and I said, where's the money? He said, well, it's in an Indian bank in Oklahoma. So I wrote about that, but this tells about Green Sky and Mrs. KB. She was fairly well known. Harrison Henry, he was 49 years old then, and I went up to the casino and the little church, and he was in the graveyard next to the church, and he had served in the Korean War. Anyway, it became quite a story. Well, the story appeared in papers in Saginaw, all of the Booth papers, Grand Rapids, Muskegon, and it was just before Thanksgiving, so the people, I guess, were in a good state of mind, and they brought trucks loaded with bedding, and they pressured the government to put trailers in at Saganing for them, because there were only about 3 or 4 houses left after 25 Saganing families had their houses burned down or fell down. The owners didn't have money to fix them, so that was kind of a good thing. I went to their church up there, and I really didn't pay much attention to them after that. I think I went somewhere else. I worked for the Times until 99. Let's see what else we got. There's a woman there. She's only 30 years old. She looks older. Betty James. What was she, 36 or 30? There's Harrison Henry up there sawing wood outside his hut. And I call it a rural ghetto, I guess. That was the best we could come up with. And of course, let's see what the next one is. Oh, Mamie Cavey. The next woman is Jane Nakchikame. Aunt Jane, she said that the chief, this goes back quite a ways, rode into where she was living down near Saginaw, on the way to Saginaw. If you go out, I forget what that road is called. And the Indian said, "You're coming with me," and that was how they got married. So she looked like quite an interesting character. Let's see what the next one is. There's the church when they had quite a congregation there, and then we're about to hit the bonanza here pretty quick. Let's see what's next. Oh, these are the Indian sites, burial grounds of villages. Of course, the Fletcher site is one of the most famous Indian sites. Michigan State University took 97 burials out of there and put them in the museum in East Lansing, and 20, 30 years later were forced to give them back to the Indians for burial in Mount Pleasant. And the Indians claim all ancient peoples, back to the beginning of time, I guess, as their right, and they want to give them proper burials, and it's still going on. So you can see there were a lot of villages on the Pinconning River also, and the Amquam Point, and on the Cawcall and Tobico Bay. And so that was the way it was. The mounds that they found, they dug into the mounds, and they found in a couple of the mounds. There's one mound was on the other side of the railroad bridge on the west side. And supposedly they found skeletons of a person, of people, 7 feet tall. And my theory is that may have led to the Paul Bunyan stories. But there was a race of Indians called the Adena people who may have come up into here during a period of plenty, and they died here and were buried in those mounds. There was a mound in Salzburg, several of them around Bay City, but they all were destroyed, and they found some interesting artifacts in there. Let's see what else we got. My wife and I, Dolores and I, were at the opening of the casino, and of course things have really changed in Saganing. Doesn't look like anybody's starving to death. So they were cutting the ribbon of the Saganing Casino. There was they were sitting around. I guess I didn't keep a picture of it, pounding on drums and smoking the peace pipe and stuff like that. So the old ways are still around. Now they're building this hotel. So let's see what the next one is, Carl. There's the white folks are getting fleeced. We don't go. We went to the opening of the Petoskey Casino. We had $10. We walked out with $100, and we said, "That's it. We're never going to a casino again." That was 15 years ago. I guess we were lucky. And I think we get a shot of the hotel replacing the shacks. Of course, none of those Indians are going to have enough money to stay at that hotel, I'm sure of that. But it's supposedly it's under construction right now. I don't think they've opened it yet. But so basically that's the story, taking it from Yeah, 1604 up till today, and a lot of the heritage that we have around here.
White's Bar is still there, isn't
Oh, you mean at Saganing?
it?
Yeah, I think
White's Beach.
the former TV guy owns it. What's his name? Yeah. No, not Eric China. No, the guy is. God, I can't think of it now. He knew that everything was coming. I had talked to him. Brando. Jay Brando owns that bar, I believe. Or he did the last I knew. So anyway, if there's any questions, I'll do my best to try to answer them. If you want a book, they're $20. Save you a little bit of money because Amazon charges about $6 for shipping. So I've got a few books here. And any questions? If I've answered everything in advance, then I've done my job, eh?
Okay, thanks, Dave. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Don.